They say the world has no more blank spaces. Satellites trace every shoreline and maps fill every corner with names. Yet there is a place, whispered through the ages, a land that exists not on paper but in the fractures of memory, Hyperborea. The ancient Greeks spoke of it as a realm beyond the north wind where the sun never sets in summer and where a race of serene, long-lived people dwelled untouched by war and hunger. Herodotus hinted, Pindar sang, others swore they had seen its light. If Hyperborea was only myth, why do fragments of its story surface in Siberian legend, Celtic lore, and the sagas of the far north? Why do certain ancient maps sketch strange coastlines where only ice exists today? Perhaps Hyperborea was not a paradise, but a memory of a time when the Arctic was green before the earth shifted and buried it under eternal frost. If so, what else has been erased from history? Come with me. Step beyond the known world into the frozen silence at the edge of the map. Let us follow the traces of a civilization the ice tried to hide long before the Arctic was drawn in shades of white and blue. Before ships with iron hulls tried to break its frozen skin, there was a word carried south on the wind, Hyperborea. To the ancient Greeks, it was not a point on a map, but a direction beyond comprehension, beyond Boreas, the breath of the north wind. Boreas himself in their mythology was the personification of winter's bite, wild hair, rushing air, the scream of ice. To imagine a land beyond him was to imagine a place untouched by the cold that defined the edge of the world. Pindar, the Theban poet, wrote of a people there who lived without toil or sickness, whose celebrations were eternal, whose lives were measured not in decades but in centuries. He spoke of rivers that never froze, of fields that needed no plow, of temples where Apollo, god of music, prophecy, and the sun, would retreat during the months when Delphi lay silent. In this telling, Hyperborea was no mythic underworld nor distant Elysium. It was a physical land bathed in an unending summer light hidden beyond the realm of known sailors. Herodotus, more cautious than the poets, could not resist recording what he had heard. He admitted he had no proof, but he preserved the rumor that north of the land of the Isidons, a mysterious people themselves, lay the Hyperboreans, and beyond them nothing but impassable deserts of snow and a sky where the sun lingered far longer than in the lands of Greece. Other writers like Hecateus of Abdera placed them on an island the size of Sicily, encircled by ocean, warmed by the gentle breath of the gods. He described their capital as a grand circular city, its streets aligned to the stars, its temples resplendent in gold and ivory. Even this detail, a city aligned with the heavens, was not unique to the Greeks. Across the world, ancient cultures set their monuments to track the motion of the sun, the tilt of the earth, the slow turning of the pole star. The Greeks believed Apollo's connection to Hyperborea was ancient, older than the stones of the Parthenon. Each winter, they said, the god would leave Delphi, riding his swan-drawn chariot to the far north to dwell among the Hyperboreans until spring returned. This cycle was mirrored in ritual. Offerings to Apollo wrapped in wheat straw were passed hand to hand from the north, from unknown lands down through the Scythians, then Thracians, until they reached the sacred island of Delos. The Greeks never met the senders, but the offerings came all the same as if carried along invisible trade winds of devotion. Yet for all their beauty, these stories carry a strangeness. The Greeks described Hyperborea's light in ways that echo what modern science knows of the Arctic Circle. In the high summer, the sun does not set for weeks. In winter, it hides for as long. The land where night never falls is not a poetic invention. It is a geographical truth, though one the Greeks could not have witnessed firsthand. Did sailors from the north bring this knowledge? Did merchants carry it in riddles and songs until it became myth? Hyperborea was not described as unreachable because of distance, but because of a barrier. The north wind itself, the Greeks imagined Boreas as more than cold air. He was a force of nature, an obstacle, a liminal threshold between the known and the forbidden. Only those favored by the gods could pass him. In this sense, Hyperborea was as much a spiritual boundary as a physical one. When we look at these accounts side by side, a pattern emerges. Each author writes with second-hand wonder. None claim to have been there. And yet the descriptions are precise enough to suggest they drew on a shared source. Perhaps from traders moving along the vast steppe routes, perhaps from the seafaring Phoenicians who ranged farther than the Greeks like to admit. In the 20th century, historians dismissed Hyperborea as an invention, a utopia projected into the blank spaces of the map. But recent studies in paleoclimatology complicate that dismissal. Ice core samples from Greenland show that during certain warm intervals in the late Pleistocene, the far north was not an endless wasteland of snow. Pollen trapped in ancient ice tells of birch and willow, of meadows where now there is only permafrost. If such a climate existed within human memory, it is not unthinkable that people lived there and that fragments of their lives filtered down into Greek lore. The Greeks, with their love for symmetry and divine order, made Hyperborea into an ideal. But like all ideals, it may have been rooted in something real, a distant echo of a place that was a place erased not by conquest but by the slow, inexorable turning of the Earth's axis and the advance of ice. Centuries later, as the age of exploration unfurled, mapmaking sought to replace myth with measurement. Yet even in these maps, drawn by hands claiming scientific authority, there are ghosts. Look closely at certain early Renaissance charts and you will find strange shapes in the far north coastlines where there should be only ice, islands sprawling across the pole, lands named but unexplained. The Piri Reis map of 1513 is the most famous of these oddities, though it shows Antarctica rather than the Arctic. In the northern hemisphere, other cartographers left similar puzzles. Oronce finds 1531 world map depicts a massive northern continent, an intricate landmass divided by 4 great rivers converging at the pole. This depiction would echo later in the works of Mercator, who repeated the idea of a central Arctic island surrounded by open seas. To modern eyes, these images seem like fantasy, the fevered dreams of men who had never seen the ice. But they beg a deeper question. Where did the inspiration come from? Mercator himself claimed his source was older still, the lost records of early travelers, perhaps Norse or even pre-Norse. According to his writings, a Franciscan friar named Nicholas of Lynn had journeyed north in the 14th century, reaching lands beyond the ice before returning to England. His account, Inventio Fortunata, is now lost, surviving only in references. Yet in those fragments, there is talk of a magnetic mountain at the pole, of a sea that swirls around it, of 4 great rivers flowing inward from the edges of a surrounding continent. It is the same pattern Fine and Mercator drew, a vision of the Arctic not as barren ice but as a navigable world. Modern historians often dismiss these maps as misinterpreted sailors' tales or symbolic geography, where features represent concepts rather than physical terrain. But we cannot ignore how many of these depictions include details that resonate with ancient myth, open polar seas, fertile northern islands, mild climates. In a way, they preserve the visual echo of Hyperborea without naming it outright. Beyond European sources, earlier world maps from the Islamic Golden Age and even from ancient China hint at unknown northern lands. The Tabula Rogeriana of Al-Idrisi in 1154 contains shapes in high latitudes that defy the known coastlines of the time. In Chinese records, the Han dynasty spoke of lands far to the north of their steppe frontiers, places where the sky's light was different, where strange animals roamed. Could these be remnants of a much older memory, passed down through successive civilizations, distorted but not erased? Geology offers a frame. During the last interglacial period, roughly 125,000 years ago, the Arctic climate was markedly warmer. Fossil evidence from sites in northern Canada and Siberia shows species of trees and animals that could not survive there today. Most strikingly, during certain warm intervals within the last 50,000 years, parts of the high Arctic may have been ice-free in summer, allowing for navigation and settlement. For sailors of the ancient world, Phoenicians, Norse, or others, such conditions would have been an invitation. The far north could have been not just reachable but desirable, rich in fish, marine mammals, and possibly arable land. Civilization flourishing there might have built harbors, towns, even monuments, only for their remains to be ground under advancing ice when the climate shifted. By the time the Greeks heard of Hyperborea, it might already have been a half-buried rumor. By the time Mercator drew his maps, it was little more than a shadow traced in ink. Maps are not neutral records. They are selective visions shaped by politics, religion, and secrecy. Throughout history, certain locations have been deliberately omitted or altered. In the 16th and 17th centuries, strategic coasts were sometimes left blank on public maps to keep them from rival powers. If a northern land had been known to a few, perhaps as a source of rare resources or symbolic power, it might have been withheld from common charts, recorded only in coded form. Over centuries, the original knowledge could slip into obscurity, its code mistaken for decoration. Some researchers, like Charles Hapgood, argued that anomalies in ancient maps, coastlines drawn with precision impossible for the mapmakers of their time, suggest the use of older source maps, perhaps from a lost seafaring culture. Hapgood's work remains controversial, but it dovetails with the notion that knowledge of the poles was not entirely absent in antiquity. If even a fragment of those hypothetical maps survived into the Renaissance, it might explain why cartographers felt justified in drawing lands where none were known to exist. Maps are treacherous artifacts. They reflect both what their makers believed and what they wanted others to believe. But even in their errors, they tell us something, that the idea of a habitable, even thriving Arctic was not alien to the human imagination. It was part of a deeper mental geography where the poles were not sterile extremes but mysterious gateways. And if the maps are wrong in detail, they may still be right in premise that the far north once held more than ice. When we think of the Arctic during the Ice Age, the mind leaps to endless white, a frozen prison where no life could thrive, but this vision is only partly true. The late Pleistocene wasn't a single unbroken winter. It was a time of extremes, oscillating between deep freezes and startling warmth. To understand how a civilization could have existed in the far north, we must look not at the ice in its maximum fury, but at those golden intervals when the polar world breathed in sunlight. The story begins in ice cores, slender cylinders of frozen time drilled from Greenland. Layer upon layer, they record not just snow, but the chemistry of ancient air, trapped bubbles of carbon dioxide, traces of volcanic ash, isotopic signatures revealing past temperatures. From these records, scientists have identified periods within the last 50,000 years when the Arctic warmed dramatically, sometimes within a single human lifetime. These Dansgaard-Oshger events saw average temperatures rise by as much as 14 degrees Fahrenheit in decades. Such surges in warmth transformed the high Arctic tundra grasslands known as Mammoth Steppe spread across Siberia, Alaska, and Canada. Hardy grasses, wildflowers, and dwarf shrubs thrived, feeding vast herds of mammoth, bison, horse. Rivers flowed freely in summer, carrying meltwater rich with nutrients to the Arctic Ocean. In such an environment, human life was not only possible, it was attractive. Archaeological evidence supports this vision. At sites like Yana rhinoceros horn in Siberia, remains of human settlement dating back 27,000 years show finely worked stone tools, bone needles, ornamental beads, signs of people adapted to cold but not living in perpetual blizzard. They exploited a landscape of seasonal abundance, fishing in ice-free rivers, hunting herds, gathering berries and roots in the brief but intense summer. The same climatic pulses that warmed Siberia softened Greenland and the Canadian Arctic. On Ellesmere Island, fossilized wood and pollen hint at a time when barren lands supported vegetation. In Alaska's North Slope, remains of steppe bison and woolly rhinoceros tell of a richness unimaginable today. If such ecosystems existed within living memory of early cultures, they could have been preserved in oral tradition long after climate shifted again. A story of a land beyond the wind where the sun lingered and life was plentiful would not be fantasy. It would be cultural memory filtered through retelling. This is how climate becomes myth. The transition back to cold could be swift and merciless. One dramatic reversal came with the younger Dryas, a sudden plunge back into near glacial conditions about 12,900 years ago. In the space of perhaps a generation, average temperatures in the northern hemisphere fell sharply. Theories abound as to the cause: meltwater pulses, comet impact, volcanic eruptions, but the effect was the same. Grasslands gave way to tundra, rivers froze longer, and human communities in the high Arctic faced a choice: adapt, migrate, or perish. Here, the story of Hyperborea might have reached its tragic turning point. If a thriving culture had arisen in the warmth of a previous interval, it would have been struck down by the return of ice. Those who fled south may have carried fragments of their culture, symbols, star lore, architectural ideas into societies they joined. Those who stayed faced harsher rhythms, their lives reshaped by scarcity. Over centuries, the physical memory of their homeland would fade, replaced by poetic memory, a golden age at the edge of the world, forever just out of reach. The late Ice Age Arctic was also a place of shifting boundaries between land and sea. With so much water locked in ice sheets, sea levels were hundreds of feet lower. Vast coastal plains now drowned beneath the Arctic Ocean once connected islands and continents. The Chukchi Sea between Siberia and Alaska was once dry steppe, part of the Bering Land Bridge, a highway for humans and animals. These exposed lands, rich with grasses and game, could host settlements seasonally, taking advantage of long summer days. Geological evidence from undersea cores in the Arctic basin shows layers of fine silt, pollen, even freshwater diatoms, microscopic algae that thrive in lakes and rivers. Such layers suggest that during warm intervals, parts of the high Arctic had conditions far more hospitable than today. For any seafaring culture, this would have opened opportunities for exploration, trade, and seasonal camps far to the north. Could they have developed complex societies there? The archaeological record is sparse, largely because rising seas and advancing ice destroyed or buried most evidence. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Many coastal settlements worldwide from this period are underwater. The Arctic would be no different. What remains may lie beneath layers of silt, waiting for technology to uncover. The climate shifts did not just change the land, they reshaped human perception of the North. To those who experienced its warmth, it was a place of abundance and light. To those who came after, it was a realm lost to time, accessible only in memory. Myths like Hyperborea may be the cultural condensation of these experiences, an enduring reminder that the world we know has not always been as it island. And so we stand at the threshold of this story. Imagine the Greeks gazing northward, past the mountains of Thrace, past unknown rivers, past Boreas himself, to where the horizon curved into mystery. In that mystery, they placed a civilization bathed in sunlight, waiting forever just beyond the wind. To them, it was Hyperborea. To us, it is a question mark on the map, a whisper in the ice, a memory of warmth at the edge of the world. Standing today on the wind-lashed ice of the polar seas, it is hard to imagine anything else. Yet, the ice itself tells the story. It remembers a time when the Arctic was green, when summer light fell on rivers and forests, when people may have looked up at the midnight sun and called their home the center of the world. If the Greeks gave Hyperborea its most poetic name, they were not the only ones to remember a land of light at the world's crown. Scattered across cultures far from the iron are tales that hum with the same frequency, a vision of the far north as a place of abundance, longevity, and divine connection. These echoes do not align perfectly. They shift in tone and detail as if filtered through different languages and climates of thought, yet together they form a chorus that is hard to ignore. In the Celtic traditions of the British Isles, there is talk of a mystical western or northern land known as Tir Nan Nog, the land of youth. It is described not as a paradise in the clouds, but as a physical realm beyond the horizon, where sickness and age do not touch the inhabitants. In some versions, the land lies across a cold sea, reached only by those favored by fate. While Celtic myth often places Tir Naug in the west, certain Beak poems hint that its light comes from a sun that never dips, a strange image for cultures used to short winter days. Further north in the sagas of the Norse, there is a memory of lands beyond the familiar fjords, past the sea ice, where the days are long and the earth is rich. Some of these tales merge into the legend of Thu, a place described by the Greek explorer Pytheas in the 4th century CE as lying 6 days' sail north of Britain. Pytheas spoke of a sun that barely set in summer, of seas thick with a gelatinous substance, likely a description of sea ice in melt, and of a fertile land supporting grain and herds. Later writers transformed Thula into Ultimatula, a poetic symbol of the world's edge. But in its earliest form, it may have been a report of real lands at high latitude. In the far east of Eurasia, among the nomadic peoples of Siberia, there are origin myths that place their ancestors in a radiant land to the north. The Nanits, whose herds of reindeer roam the Yamal Peninsula, tell of a time when their people came from a place where the sun's path was different, where the air was soft and the rivers ran wide. The Chukchi, farther east, have tales of journeys to a distant shore across the ice, where strangers with strange tools and bright clothing traded gifts. These stories blur the line between human memory and shamanic vision. Yet their geography is striking. The direction is always northward toward lands, now locked under ice and sea. Even in the traditions of the Scythians, the horse-riding peoples who roamed the Eurasian steppe, there is a whisper of the Hyperborean theme. Greek historians noted that Scythian legends spoke of golden objects that fell from the sky in the far north, guarded by a people untouched by time. These objects, perhaps meteorites, were said to mark a sacred land inaccessible to outsiders. The Scythians themselves may have acted as intermediaries, carrying goods, stories, and perhaps even physical offerings from those lands to the Mediterranean. Why do these distant cultures share such similar imagery? One answer may lie in the trade and migration networks of the ancient world. Before the rise of empires, the steppe and the sea acted as highways, connecting communities thousands of miles apart. A story told in one village could within a few generations travel the length of a continent, altered but still recognizable. If there had once been a real northern land with unusual light and seasonal abundance, its fame could have spread far beyond its borders. Another answer lies in the shared experience of latitude itself. For peoples living near or above the Arctic Circle, the contrast between summer and winter light is profound. In summer, the sun hangs in the sky for weeks, casting a golden glow over land and water. In winter, darkness reigns. This extreme rhythm can imprint itself on the imagination, making the idea of an eternal summer both tantalizing and plausible. Cultures hearing of such a place from travelers could have elevated it into legend, regardless of whether they believed it still existed. Archaeology adds a further dimension. Across northern Europe and Asia, there are megalithic structures, ancient petroglyphs, and burial sites that suggest sustained human activity in latitudes once thought uninhabitable in deep prehistory. Some of these sites align with solar events, tracking the movements of the sun with precision. The same impulse that led the builders of Stonehenge to mark the solstices may have driven northern peoples to encode their relationship with the sun into stone. A relationship far more intimate in regions where daylight can vanish or dominate entirely. If we compare the myths of Hyperborea, Tyr, Nanog, Thula, and the Siberian northern lands, certain motifs recur. The journey to a remote and often hidden place, the presence of perpetual or extended daylight, the absence of disease or decay, and a connection to the divine or the extraordinary. These are not the vague qualities of an afterlife. They are physical characteristics that could, in a different climate regime, belong to a real geographic location. This is where modern science and ancient story meet. Geological and climatic evidence tells us that the Arctic has not always been the frozen desert of today. In warmer periods, it could have supported human life, even flourishing societies. The myths may be the fossilized remnants of those societies' reputations, passed down through oral tradition, reshaped by poets, and reframed to fit each culture's cosmology. And so Hyperborea need not have been a single place known to all, but rather a shared archetype born of multiple encounters with the same phenomenon, a habitable far north. To the Greeks, it was the land beyond barriers. To the Celts, a youthful paradise. To the Norse, Thursday to the Siberian nomads, the cradle of ancestors. Different names, different roots, but perhaps the same memory. Standing at the crossroads of these traditions, we are left with a haunting possibility. If so many cultures recall a land of light at the top of the world, then perhaps buried under ice and ocean, such a land once truly existed. Long before satellites and telescopes, humanity's first observatories were not towers of glass and steel, but open skies above stone and earth. The ancients did not simply watch the stars, they measured them, memorized their paths, and wove their rhythms into myth. In the quest to understand where Hyperborea might have been, these myths and measurements often overlap in ways that are too precise to dismiss. In Greek accounts, Hyperborea was beyond the north wind, but more subtly, it was tied to the path of the sun and the position of the stars. Apollo, the god most closely associated with the Hyperboreans, was also a solar deity. His winter departure from Delhi to spend months among them mirrors the seasonal movement of the sun itself, lower in the sky during Greece's winter, higher and seemingly dwelling in the far north during summer. This is not just poetic imagery. It is an astronomical truth for anyone who has traveled close to or within the Arctic Circle, where the sun can remain above the horizon for days or even weeks. The Greeks were not alone in their fascination with the far north sky. Across cultures, ancient astronomers paid special attention to the pole star and the circumpolar constellations, the ones that never set, forever circling the horizon. In regions closer to the equator, these constellations dip below the horizon part of the night. But at higher latitudes, they dominate the sky, forming a fixed celestial crown. For a people living far to the north, these stars would have been constant companions, their positions shifting subtly over centuries due to the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, a phenomenon we now call precession. That wobble, imperceptible in a single lifetime, changes which star marks the north over thousands of years. Today, Polaris holds the role. But in ancient times, it was Kuchab, and before that, Thubin in the constellation Draco. To a culture rooted in the Arctic, the movement of this immovable point would have been both a navigational concern and a sacred mystery. If Hyperborea was indeed a real place in the high north, its inhabitants might have built structures aligned to these shifting polar markers. Much as the Egyptians aligned pyramids to Tuban during their construction, archaeology in high latitude regions has uncovered alignments that raise questions. In the far north of Norway, the ancient site at Geoke, though much farther south in Germany, shows one of the earliest known solar observatories with gates aligned to the winter and summer solstices. In Arctic Siberia, certain stone arrangements appear to mark sunrise and sunset positions at solstice, though their exact dating remains debated. Even the enigmatic megaliths of the Kola Peninsula seem to bear patterns that could be interpreted as astronomical. Why would these alignments matter? In the Arctic, the sun's path changes dramatically over the year. Knowing precisely when the sun will return after the long winter darkness or when it will vanish into the polar night could mean the difference between survival and starvation. For a settled community, such knowledge would also take on ritual significance, marking the turning points of the year with celebrations, offerings, and perhaps the sending of emissaries, as in the Greek tale of offerings traveling from Hyperborea to Delos. There is also the intriguing connection between Hyperborea and the concept of a central land. Several ancient sources, including Hecatos of Abdera and later geographers, describe Hyperborea as lying at the center of the world in a cosmological sense, if not a literal one. This imagery aligns with how many ancient cultures conceived the pole as the axis mundi, the world axis around which the heavens revolve. For peoples who navigated by the stars, this point was both a practical guide and a sacred symbol, a fixed anchor in a shifting sky. We see similar motifs in other traditions. In Hindu cosmology, Mount Meru stands at the center of the world, its summit aligned with the pole star. In Norse myth, the world tree Yggdrasil connects the realms, its roots and branches touching the heavens and underworld, a vertical axis that mirrors the polar connection. In all these cases, the center is not geographic for its own sake, but celestial, linked to the unchanging point around which all else turns. If Hyperborea was imagined or remembered as a land beneath that celestial crown, then its placement on ancient maps was not arbitrary. It would be north, not only in physical distance, but in symbolic orientation, land aligned with the heavens themselves. Such an alignment would amplify its sacred status in the minds of those who had never been there but had heard of its wonders. Modern astronomy adds a layer of plausibility. If we project the precession of the equinoxes backward, we find that the position of the pole star shifts significantly over millennia. Certain eras would have made the Arctic sky particularly striking, with the pole aligned more directly with bright stars or with certain constellations in prominent positions during summer. These visual changes could have been encoded in myth, marking the golden age of a polar culture sky. Ancient seafarers may also have used the stars to reach northern waters. While compasses were unknown in the Mediterranean world of the Greeks, navigation by the stars was a developed skill. The consistent presence of circumpolar constellations could have served as a guide for voyages northward, especially in summer when the midnight sun fades into a long twilight and the brightest stars still shine. If any sailors reached lands beyond the Arctic Circle during a warm climate phase, their accounts mingled with awe and distortion could have been the seed for Hyperborea's legend. In the end, ancient astronomy does more than place Hyperborea on a speculative map. It roots it in a framework of observation and memory. The people who spoke of it were not just telling fairy tales. They were interpreting the movements of the heavens, connecting them to places on earth, and preserving those connections in story and stone. And if somewhere beneath the ice there was once a city aligned to the summer solstice, or a temple facing the never-setting star, then Hyperborea's position is not lost forever. It is written in the sky, waiting to be read again. If the Greeks preserved Hyperborea in marble words, the peoples of the far north carried its echoes in living breath, in songs around winter fires, in carvings on bone, in stories that pass between generations like an unbroken thread. Here at the edges of the Arctic Circle, myth and memory intertwine so tightly that to separate them is to lose their meaning. Among the Sami of northern Scandinavia, the reindeer herders whose lives follow the migrations of their herds, there are old tales of a land where the sun dances on the horizon and the wind carries no bite. In some versions, it is a sacred place reached only by the Noidi, the shaman, during trance journeys. In others, it is a real territory somewhere beyond the highest mountains to the north, where rivers are full of fish so plentiful they leap into nets without effort. The Sami never called this land Hyperborea, but the pattern is there: remoteness, abundance, and an enduring light. To the west, Norse sagas offer a different kind of memory. While much of their mythology is dominated by tales of gods and giants, some sagas record voyages into strange northern waters. One such account describes sailing past the familiar coastlines of Finnmark into seas where the midnight sun blazed so brightly that night was no darker than a cloudy day. There, the air was warmer than expected, and the land, though barren in places, showed signs of human habitation. Stone structures, scars, and markings on rock that resembled ships and animals. Whether these were Norse exaggerations or remnants of older settlements, the idea of a north beyond the known north took root. Farther east, in the vast expanse of Siberia, the Nenets people have kept oral histories that stretch back beyond written time. One Nenets elder described in a story recorded in the early 20th century a place where the sun rests high in the sky and where the rivers run wide and gentle. The people there, he said, were strong and lived long lives, their clothes bright and adorned with patterns unlike those of the tundra tribes. Such descriptions, while dreamlike, suggest a remembered difference, a cultural contrast with the harsh conditions of modern Siberia. The Chukchi, whose homeland lies on the far eastern edge of Asia, speak of visitors arriving from across the polar sea. These strangers came in large skin boats, bringing gifts of metal, beads, and woven cloth. In return, they received furs and ivory. The Chukchi stories never place these strangers in a specific direction. But the recurring detail of the sea that does not freeze in their tales points towards the influence of warmer currents, something possible in certain climatic intervals in the prehistoric Arctic. Even more intriguing are the archaeological traces scattered across the north. On Zhukov Island, far out in the East Siberian Sea, excavations have revealed a human settlement dating back over 8,000 years, astonishingly old for such a remote location. The people of Zhukov hunted polar bears and reindeer, built semi-upturned houses for insulation, and crafted sleds, suggesting long-distance travel. While the site shows no sign of monumental architecture, its very existence demonstrates that humans have lived and even thrived deep within the Arctic for millennia. Similar finds in the Yana River basin show that human presence in these latitudes extends back at least 27,000 years. At the Yana rhinoceros horn site, beads, tools, and worked ivory tell of a people not merely surviving but shaping their environment with skill. These communities would have witnessed profound climatic swings and perhaps carried with them ancestral memories of warmer, greener Arctic land. If we see Hyperborea not as a single lost kingdom but as a cultural memory of multiple high latitude societies, then the traditions of the Sami, Norse, Nets, and Chukchi become pieces of a larger mosaic. Each preserves elements of the same archetype, a northern realm of light and abundance, reachable yet remote, familiar yet somehow apart from ordinary life. One striking commonality across these cultures is the role of the shaman or spiritual traveler in bridging worlds. In Sami practice, the Noidi could journey in trance to distant realms, guided by the rhythm of the drum and the imagery of the northern lights. Among the Chukchi, shamans were said to ride reindeer or spirit birds into the sky, crossing to lands where the seasons were reversed, where light ruled over darkness. These visionary journeys may be metaphorical, but they mirror physical voyages. A skilled navigator in the Arctic could, in a matter of days or weeks, move between vastly different climates and light conditions, especially during times of climatic instability. The Norse, too, imbued their far north with mysticism. Beyond the human settlements, Limer, the land of giants, a place of power and danger. While mythic in form, such concepts often grew from encounters with real landscapes that inspired awe, towering ice cliffs, volcanic mountains, or seas choked with icebergs. In warm phases, when such extremes receded, those same regions might have seemed almost paradisical by contrast. Over centuries, as climates cooled and coastlines shifted, these lands receded into legend. For the Sami, they became the domain of spirits. For the Norse, the stage of heroic voyages. For the Siberian peoples, the source of ancestral gifts and stories. By the time European explorers in the modern era sailed into the Arctic, they encountered only the icebound remnant of what had once been a shifting and dynamic world. And yet, listening to these northern traditions today, one cannot shake the sense of continuity. The details, the light that lingers, the rivers full of fish, the strangers from across the sea, do not feel invented from nothing. They feel like echoes worn smooth by time of real encounters with places that existed in a different Arctic than the one we know. Perhaps Hyperborea survives not in ruins buried under ice, but in these threads of living memory still carried in the voices of those who have never left the North. For centuries, the Arctic was seen as a place without deep history, a frozen wasteland where survival was possible, but civilization was unthinkable. Archaeologists once believed that any ancient human presence in these latitudes would have been fleeting, seasonal, and technologically primitive. But in the last few decades, the ice has begun to give back its secrets. What has emerged challenges the old assumption and opens the door to the possibility that high-latitude cultures, perhaps the seed of the Hyperborean legend, were more complex and enduring than anyone suspected. One of the most remarkable finds lies on a remote island in the East Siberian Sea, Zhukov Island. Today it is barren, wind-scarred, and locked in ice for most of the year. But around 8,000 years ago, it hosted a permanent human settlement. Excavations at Zhukov have revealed the remains of semi-subterranean houses insulated with earth and animal skins, tools made of stone and bone, and perhaps most striking, evidence of long distance and transport. Archaeologists found obsidian blades whose stone could only have come from hundreds of miles away, suggesting trade networks that spanned the Arctic. Even more unexpected were fragments of wooden sleds indicating the use of domesticated dogs for transport long before this practice was thought to have developed. Farther inland along the Yana River in Siberia, another site has pushed the timeline of Arctic settlement back dramatically. The Jana Rhinoceros horn site, discovered in the early 2000 seconds, dates to nearly 27,000 years ago, deep into the last glacial maximum. Here, researchers found thousands of artifacts, spear points, awls, beads made of mammoth ivory, and decorative engravings. The people who lived here hunted large game, fished the rivers, and crafted tools with an artistry that speaks of a refined tradition, not a desperate fight for survival. Their ability to thrive in such conditions suggests they were inheritors of knowledge built over generations, not mere wanderers chasing prey. In Alaska, sites like the Mesa Complex and the remains found on the North Slope show that humans were present in the high Arctic thousands of years before the first Norse longships ventured into northern seas. These early inhabitants adapted their technology to the environment. Dwellings partially dug into the ground for insulation, clothing sewn with bone needles for maximum protection against wind, and weapons designed to take down both terrestrial and marine game. The archaeological record reveals a resourcefulness that would have made prolonged settlement and even cultural flourishing possible during warmer phases of the Arctic climate. The Canadian Arctic offers further pieces of the puzzle. On Baffin Island, unusual woven textiles found at the Nanook site have sparked debate. Some researchers argue they could be evidence of contact between Arctic peoples and Norse settlers centuries before Columbus reached the Americas. Others suggest they point to an indigenous weaving tradition older still. Either way, the presence of such artifacts in a place so remote hints at networks of exchange, networks that could have carried not just goods but stories. Even older and more enigmatic are the stone structures found on the Kola Peninsula in northwest Russia. These megalithic formations, often dismissed as natural until closer examination, bear patterns of alignment that some researchers believe correspond to solar and lunar cycles. While their exact age remains contested, they suggest that ancient Arctic peoples may have engaged in astronomical observation, a skill that would have been invaluable for tracking seasons in a land of extreme light and darkness. Taken together, these finds paint a picture of the far north, not as a fringe habitat visited by accident, but as a place inhabited by skilled, adaptable peoples who could organize labor, engage in long-distance trade, and perhaps even develop complex cultural identities. None of the sites individually match the grand image of Hyperborea described by Greek poets. There are no golden temples or cities of marble beneath the tundra, but collectively they reveal something equally compelling: that the conditions for such a society could have existed, and that if one did, its material traces might now lie hidden under ice, sea, or sediment. It is important to remember that the Arctic is one of the least explored archaeological frontiers on Earth. Vast areas remain untouched by excavation, either because they are too remote or because they lie beneath layers of permafrost that make digging nearly impossible. Climate change, while catastrophic in its own right, is beginning to expose some of these areas for the first time in millennia. As ice recedes and thawing ground reveals ancient camps, tools, and even human remains, the map of Arctic prehistory is being redrawn. One cannot help but imagine what might yet be found. The remains of a seafaring culture whose boats hugged ice-free summer coasts, stone circles marking the passage of the sun at the pole, burial sites with artifacts that show influence from far-off lands. If Hyperborea was a real place, whether a single settlement or a network of northern communities, its ruins could still lie in wait, preserved in the cold as Pompeii was in ash. Even if no such singular discovery ever emerges, the archaeology we already have forces a re-evaluation of how we think about the ancient North. It shows us that human ingenuity is not bound by latitude, that stories of northern abundance could have sprung from lived experience, and that the Greek vision of a thriving land beyond the north wind may not have been pure invention. The Hyperborea of poetry may be gone, but its foundations in trade, survival, and adaptation are written in the stones, bones, and forgotten tools of the Arctic's first peoples. The ancient vision of a northern land of light, whether called Hyperborea, Thu, or by some other name, has long carried an aura of mystery. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this mystique was repurposed, reshaped, and in some cases corrupted by political and ideological agendas. The name Thu, drawn from classical sources, became more than a geographical curiosity. It was transformed into a symbol of racial origin, spiritual destiny, and even geopolitical ambition. The earliest known reference to Thu comes from the Greek explorer Pytheas of Massalia, who sailed north around the 4th century BCE. His Thu was a land 6 days' sail from Britain, where the summer sun barely set. Later writers placed it at the edge of the known world, but they did not agree on its exact location. Some thought it Iceland, others Greenland, and a few imagined it even farther north. This ambiguity gave the concept an unusual flexibility. Thu could be anywhere on the blurred frontier between myth and geography. By the 19th century, as Europe's fascination with racial origins intensified, Thule was reinterpreted through the lens of emerging theories about an Aryan homeland. The term Aryan, originally a linguistic classification for the Indo-European language family, was gradually twisted into a racial category by certain philologists, anthropologists, and ideologues. In this reimagining, the Aryans were not simply speakers of related languages. They were a distinct people, superior in intellect and culture, who had radiated outward from a single point of origin. For some theorists, that point was Tula, imagined as a lost Arctic homeland. One of the earliest popularizers of this idea was the French writer Joseph Alexandre Saint-Talvre. In his esoteric works of the late 1800 seconds, Santi blended theosophy, occultism, and speculative history to describe an advanced hidden civilization from the north. Though his Agartha was more often placed underground, the association between high civilization and polar regions began to gain traction in mystical circles. Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society, also spoke of a polar origin for the so-called root races of humanity. In her writings, the Arctic, sometimes literal, sometimes symbolic, was linked to a primordial age when spiritual and physical conditions were very different. The polar homeland, she suggested, was the cradle of an advanced people who later spread across the earth, leaving behind fragments of their knowledge in ancient cultures. It was the Germanic reinterpretation of Tula, however, that would have the most lasting and dangerous impact. In the early 20th century, German nationalist thinkers seized upon the idea of a northern homeland for the Aryan race. They envisioned Thu not merely as a historical place but as a spiritual and racial ideal. The Thu Society, founded in Munich in 1918, was part political organization, part occult study group. It combined romanticized notions of ancient Germanic heritage with racial pseudotions and a fascination with lost civilizations. Members of the Thu Society believed that their ancestors had come from a vanished land in the far north, a place of purity and power that had been destroyed by a cataclysm, possibly linked to the end of the last ice age. They saw themselves as the inheritors of this legacy, destined to restore the greatness of their forebears. In this narrative, Thule was not just a curiosity from ancient geography. It was the foundation myth for a racial and national identity. The Society's ideas influenced a number of figures who would later play roles in the rise of the Nazi Party. Though the exact nature of that influence remains debated by historians, what is clear is that the myth of Thula was absorbed into the broader Nazi fascination with origins, purity, and destiny. Heinrich Himmler's SS, for example, had its own research branch, the Anunurba, dedicated to uncovering the archaeological and historical truth of such myths. Expeditions were sent to Tibet, the Arctic, and other remote locations in search of evidence for these theories, efforts that were part science, part propaganda. This politicization of the Thu concept distorted its historical and mythological roots. In ancient sources, Thu was a liminal space, a place at the edge of the known world, remarkable for its light and its distance. In modern ideological hands, it became a rigid symbol, stripped of nuance, and used to justify exclusion, conquest, and worse. The Hyperborea of Greek poetry and the Thule of Pythias' voyage were never racial manifestos. They were invitations to wonder about the world's edges. But in the fevered imagination of early 20th century nationalism, they became tools for drawing lines between people rather than for exploring the unknown. Beyond politics, the idea of a polar homeland also found a home in the alternative history and fringe science communities of the 20th century. Writers like Hermann Vaux and later Robert Shahu proposed that the Arctic had once been the seat of a technologically advanced civilization whose influence could be seen in the myths, symbols, and monuments of disparate cultures. These theories often pointed to similarities in solar symbols, megalithic architecture, and navigation skills across the ancient world, as evidence of a shared origin in the north. While mainstream archaeology finds no direct proof of such a culture, the persistence of the idea shows the enduring allure of a polar origin story. In the end, the modern history of Thu is a cautionary tale about how ancient myths can be appropriated, reshaped, and weaponized. What began as a vague but fascinating geographic reference in the writings of a Greek explorer became over centuries a mirror for whatever a culture wished to see. A utopia, a lost Eden, a racial homeland, a spiritual center, each retelling says as much about the teller as it does about the myth itself. Yet, stripped of its ideological baggage, the Fool of Antiquity still resonates with the same questions that gave rise to Hyperborea. Was there once a habitable, even flourishing land in the far north? Could human cultures have thrived there during warmer phases of the Ice Age? And if so, what traces might remain beneath the ice? These questions, unclaimed by politics, still invite us to look toward the pole, to the place where maps once faded into white and imagination took over. If there is any truth behind the idea of Hyperborea or Thu, it will not be found in poetry or political mythology. It will be written in the earth itself. Geology, more than any ancient text, holds the record of what the Arctic once was and what it might have hidden. To trace the possibility of a lost land in the far north, we must strip away modern ice and follow the story told in rock, sediment, and seafloor. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 years ago, vast ice sheets covered much of North America, northern Europe, and parts of Siberia. Sea levels were more than 400 feet lower than they are today. The geography of the north was radically different. Continental shelves that are now submerged lay exposed, forming broad plains and connecting islands. The Bering Land Bridge, or Bingia, joined Asia to North America, creating a vast steppe that stretched from Siberia to Alaska. This was not a wasteland. It was a rich grassland ecosystem supporting mammoths, horses, bison, and the humans who hunted them. The Arctic Ocean itself, while still encircled by ice in many seasons, likely had pockets of open water and more extensive coastlines. Biometric maps, charts of the ocean floor reveal features that would have been above sea level during periods of low water. Ridges, plateaus, and shallow basins that could have supported plant and animal life. The Luminosaf Ridge, which runs across the Arctic Ocean from Siberia to Greenland, is one such feature. Today, it lies beneath hundreds of meters of water, but when sea levels were lower, parts of it may have stood as dry land or supported icy areas in summer. Geologists have also identified submerged river channels and ancient shorelines on the Arctic seabed. These are relics from a time when rivers flowed across plains that are now drowned. Sediment cores taken from these regions sometimes contain pollen from trees and plants that no longer grow anywhere near the Arctic. Such findings suggest that during interglacial periods, the warmer phases between ice ages, parts of the far north had climates mild enough to sustain forests and grasslands. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence comes from a site called the New Siberian Islands. These islands, scattered in the Arctic waters north of Siberia, are littered with the bones of mammoths and other large mammals. Some of these remains are so well preserved that they still contain hair and soft tissue. Their abundance points to a time when the surrounding area, much of it now submerged, was a vast grazing land, not a frozen desert. If humans lived in this landscape, their settlements could now lie underwater, awaiting discovery. There was also the question of post-glacial rebound, the slow rising of land once compressed under the weight of ice sheets. In Scandinavia and parts of Canada, the land is still rising today, thousands of years after the ice retreated. In the Arctic, this process could mean that some coastal areas are older than they appear, while others have sunk due to shifting weight and changing sea levels. The interplay of rising and sinking land complicates the search for ancient shorelines and makes it possible that entire regions have disappeared beneath the waves. The Greenland ice sheet too hides an ancient landscape beneath it. Radar surveys have revealed mountain ranges, valleys, and even what appears to be the bed of a massive pre-glacial river system buried under miles of ice. These hidden features tell us that before Greenland became the frozen giant we know today, it was a complex, habitable terrain. If similar buried landscapes exist under parts of the Arctic Oceans as ice, they could conceal the remains of ecosystems and perhaps human presence from a warmer time. Some researchers have gone further, proposing that certain submerged features in the Arctic could be remnants of shelf cities, coastal settlements that were lost to rising seas at the end of the last ice age. While this remains speculative, parallels exist in other parts of the world. The sunken city of Dwara in India, the structures of the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, and the flooded Neolithic site of Doggerland in the North Sea. Doggerland, once a broad plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe, was a thriving habitat for humans and animals before it was swallowed by the sea. Its rediscovery proves that entire landscapes and the cultures within them can vanish from memory only to be revealed again by science. The Younger Dry, a sudden return to cold around 12,900 years ago, would have accelerated such losses in the Arctic if sea ice expanded rapidly, cutting off coastal access, and meltwater floods later submerged low-lying areas. Any settlements on exposed continental shelves could have been erased in a matter of centuries. In human terms, that is only a few generations. Enough for memory to survive as legend, but not enough for archaeology to preserve easily accessible ruins. Modern technology is beginning to close the gap. Side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profiling, and autonomous underwater vehicles can map the seafloor in unprecedented detail. Already, surveys have found anomalies, geometric features, and unusual formations in areas of the Arctic shelf that were once dry land. While most turn out to be natural, the possibility remains that one day a structure or artifact will surface that confirms the presence of a lost Arctic culture. Of course, even if no such Hyperborean city is found, the geological evidence already tells a story aligned with the myth's skeleton. There were times when the far north was warmer, more accessible, and capable of supporting abundant life. During those times, land now hidden beneath ice and sea could have been the home of peoples whose existence we know only through whispers in ancient texts. In the end, the Arctic is not a static white desert. It is a restless landscape sculpted by cycles of ice and thaw, rise and fall. The Hyperborea of legend may be gone, but the earth remembers it in ridges beneath the sea. Pollen locked in sediment and bones scattered on islands no one inhabited in recorded history. And if we follow those clues far enough, we may yet find the place where myth and geology meet. When most people picture the Arctic, they imagine a monochrome world, ice stretching to the horizon, snow-blurred skies, and an emptiness broken only by the occasional polar bear. Yet, this frozen image is only a recent chapter in the Arctic story. For much of the last 100,000 years, the high north has cycled through phases of abundance and desolation. In the warmer intervals, it was not a wasteland, but a sprawling, vibrant ecosystem. One that could have sustained human life on a scale large enough to leave cultural traces that later became the seeds of the Hyperborean legend. Scientists call it the mammoth steppe, a biome unlike anything that exists today. So it stretched from France across the plains of Eurasia through Siberia and over the Bering Land Bridge into Alaska and the Yukon. In this world, grasses and sedges dominated the landscape mixed with wildflowers, mosses, and dwarf shrubs. There were no vast forests, but the open plains were rich in nutrients, able to support one of the highest biomasses of large animals ever known. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, stebison, wild horses, musk oxen, and reindeer roamed in immense herds. Predators like cave lions, wolves, and the scimitar-toothed cat stalked them, Rivers teemed with salmon during seasonal runs, while lakes and wetlands hosted flocks of migratory birds. In summer, the sun shone for weeks without setting, flooding the land with light that fueled explosive plant growth. For human hunters and gatherers, it was a land of plenty, provided they could endure the extremes of winter. Fossil evidence shows that even islands now locked in year-round ice were once rich grazing grounds. The new Siberian islands, today a bleak scattering of tundra, have yielded enormous quantities of mammoth bones. Many of them so fresh-looking that early explorers thought the animals had died only recently. Radiocarbon dating proved they were thousands of years old, preserved by the permafrost. Such preservation speaks of a climate that, while cold, was stable enough to sustain life in great abundance for long stretches of time. Further back in time, during interglacial periods, the Arctic warmed even more. Pollen records from lake sediments in Alaska and northern Canada reveal the presence of birch, willow, and even spruce trees that could not survive in those regions today. In Greenland, ice cores have trapped traces of ancient insects and plant material from similar warm phases. During these times, the Arctic would have been a mosaic of grasslands, wetlands, and scattered forests, offering resources far beyond what the modern tundra provides. This environment was not static. Climate shifts could occur over mere decades, transforming grasslands into snowfields or opening ice coasts to navigation. Such changes would have been both a challenge and an opportunity for ancient peoples. Warmer periods allowed them to move farther north, exploiting rich hunting grounds and fish rivers, and colder pulses drove them south or forced them to adapt with new technologies, insulated dwellings, tailored clothing, and seasonal mobility. For the peoples who lived through these transitions, the memory of a lush Arctic would have been powerful. Imagine a community forced to abandon a once fertile land as the ice advanced, watching from the south as it disappeared into snow and myth. Within a few generations, the stories of that place could have transformed into tales of a golden homeland at the edge of the world. A Hyperborea. Archaeological finds fit this picture. Sites like the Jana rhinoceros horn settlement in Siberia, dating back nearly 27,000 years, show humans living deep in the Arctic, hunting reindeer and mammoth, fishing and making intricate tools and ornaments. These were not desperate survivors clinging to life. They were skilled, organized people drawing on a rich ecosystem. In Alaska's North Slope, similar evidence suggests that early Paleo-Inuit cultures thrived in coastal areas rich with marine mammals and migratory birds. The productivity of the mammoth steppe was so great that some scientists argue it rivaled the African savanna in its ability to support large animal populations. This is no small point. Where large animals thrive, humans can thrive too. Meat, hides, bones, and sinew provided food, clothing, shelter, and tools. Abundant resources also meant that not every moment had to be devoted to survival. There was time for social life, ritual, and perhaps even the construction of symbolic sites. The kind of cultural activity that can leave traces in myth long after its physical remains vanish. Of course, this bounty came with limits. The Arctic summer, for all its endless light, was brief. Winters were long and punishing, and in some regions, darkness could last for months. Surviving these extremes required careful preparation, drying fish and meat for storage, crafting layered clothing from animal hides, and building shelters that conserved heat. The presence of these adaptations in the archaeological record tells us that ancient Arctic peoples were not transient visitors but deeply knowledgeable inhabitants of their environment. The collapse of this ecosystem came in stages. Around 12,900 years ago, the younger dust triggered a rapid cooling that disrupted plant growth and reduced the carrying capacity of the land. Over the following millennia, many of the megafauna vanished. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, and the giant steppe bison among them. Some scientists point to human hunting as a contributing factor. Others emphasize climate change. Whatever the cause, the loss of these species transformed the Arctic into the lower biomass tundra we know today. Yet the memory of the older, richer world could have endured in oral tradition. Even after the great herds were gone, the stories of their abundance and of the long summer days that nourished them might have been told to new generations. To listeners who had never seen such abundance, these tales would sound like visions of paradise. And so the mammoth steppe could live on, not in reality, but in the imagination, rebranded as a mythical hyperarea. From a modern perspective, the ancient Arctic ecosystem is a reminder that climate is never fixed. The land we see today, white and severe, is only one version of the north. Beneath the ice and snow lies the memory of a different world, one of green grass, roaming herds, and human footprints. The bones, pollen, and sediments are its archive. The myths are its poetry. Together, they whisper of a time when the Arctic was not a dead end, but a cradle. If the ancient Arctic once bloomed with grasslands, rivers, and herds, then it was not just a place to live, it was a place to depart from. A fertile north would have been a launching point, sending people outward in waves when climate shifted, resources changed, or new opportunities beckoned. This idea that humans could have radiated from a high latitude homeland has long been a subject of speculation. From the sober hypotheses of archaeologists to the more extravagant visions of mythmakers, in the case of Hyperborea, the migrations themselves may be the bridge between history and legend. Human genetics offers part of the picture. Modern DNA studies show deep links between populations in Siberia, Northern Europe, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. One key genetic marker known as haplogroup Q is shared between Siberian groups and Native Americans, suggesting a common ancestry that passed through the high north thousands of years ago. Another haplogroup X has a more mysterious distribution appearing both in Europe and in certain Native American groups, such as the Ojibwe, in patterns that are not fully explained by known migration routes. These threads hint at a complex web of movements through Arctic corridors in the late Plein. The most famous of these corridors was Beringia, the now submerged land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska during periods of low sea level. For thousands of years, this region was not just a narrow crossing, but a vast steppe rich in game and vegetation. Archaeological finds suggest that people lived on Beringia itself for extended periods, adapting to its seasonal rhythms before dispersing eastward into the Americas and westward back into Eurasia. If any northern cradle of culture existed, Beringia would have been part of its heartland. But Beringia was not the only path. In warmer intervals, the Arctic coastline could have been navigable by small boats, allowing movement along what is now the ice-clogged shores of the Arctic Ocean. Seafaring traditions are deeply rooted in many Arctic cultures, from the skin boats of the Chukchi and Inuit to the umiaks and kayaks of Greenland. And it is not difficult to imagine ancient mariners following the summer melt to reach new lands. Such voyages could have carried not only people but stories, weaving a shared mythology across vast distances. In the genetic record of modern Scandinavians and certain Siberian peoples, there are signals of ancient gene flow that suggest contact across the Arctic. While these links are often explained through later movements such as the spread of Uralic-speaking peoples, some researchers speculate that they could preserve traces of much older pre-agricultural connections. If so, the land beyond the North Wind might have been less isolated than the myths suggest, acting as a hub in a network of seasonal migrations. Oral traditions from different parts of the North speak of ancestors coming from lands now inaccessible. Among the Inuit, there are stories of the Tunit, a people said to be larger, stronger, and more skilled in certain crafts than the Inuit themselves, who eventually vanished or moved away. In parts of northern Russia, tales speak of a golden age when the ancestors lived in a land of endless summer, only to be driven south by advancing cold. In both cases, the direction of origin is toward the pole. These migrations would not have been single dramatic exoduses. More likely, they unfolded over centuries, with families and clans moving gradually, following herds or seeking better fishing grounds. As they traveled, they would have blended with other groups, carrying elements of their original culture into new environments. In some cases, they may have brought technological skills, boat building, navigation, astronomical observation that gave them advantages over the peoples they encountered. Such advantages could easily feed into the legends of outsiders arriving with strange powers or knowledge. There was also the question of symbolic migration, the movement of ideas rather than people. A story once told can travel farther and faster than its tellers. If tales of a northern homeland were compelling enough, they could spread independently of actual migration picked up and reshaped by each culture along the way. Over time, these tales could accumulate details from many sources, fusing memory and imagination into a coherent myth. From a practical standpoint, leaving the north was not always a matter of choice. Climatic downturns like the onset of the younger Duz could make survival nearly impossible in certain latitudes. Declining game populations, freezing rivers, and shortened summers would force communities to relocate or perish. For those who left, the abandoned homeland would linger in memory as a place of plenty, its loss amplified by the hardships of the new environment. This emotional weight is a powerful driver of myth-making. We can imagine such a migration through the eyes of one generation. The elders remembering rivers that never froze, pastures where the reindeer grazed in their thousands, the young knowing only the harsh reality of a colder world. Around the fire, the stories would grow, not simply as records of the past, but as anchors of identity, reminders that their people had once lived in a better place. In time, those stories could be transformed into the Hyperborea of Greek poets or the Fool of Norse explorers. In this light, the myth of Hyperborea may not describe a single lost city or kingdom, but the memory of a broad, interconnected Arctic world, one that served as a starting point for human journeys in many directions. Its people may have left little in the way of monumental architecture, but they left their mark in genes, languages, technologies, and stories scattered across half the globe. The migrations from this hypothetical northern homeland would thus be less like the fall of a single civilization and more like the dispersal of seeds, each carried by wind and water, taking root in new soils, yet all sharing a common origin. And if we could trace those roots far enough, following the tangled lines of DNA, archaeology, and oral tradition, we might find that they converge in the high latitudes in a land that is now hidden under ice and sea. For now, the migrations remain partly a map of possibility, but possibility, when paired with fragments of evidence, can be enough to keep a legend alive. And so the image of Hyperborea endures not as a static place, but as a point of departure, forever sending its children into the wider world. If the migrations from a once fertile Arctic homeland carried people and skills into the wider world, then their legacy might not only be found in DNA or in the faint trails of oral tradition. It might also survive in the way those descendants built, decorated, and conceived their sacred spaces. Architecture and art often outlast the societies that created them, and certain patterns, recurring motifs, alignments, and structural concepts can act like fingerprints hinting at shared origins. In the case of Hyperborea, these fingerprints may be faint, but they appear in unexpected places. One of the most persistent elements in the myth of Hyperborea is its association with the sun. In Greek accounts, Apollo spends part of the year among the Hyperboreans, and offerings to him were said to come from the north. In a high-latitude homeland where the sun behaves in extraordinary ways, never setting in summer, never rising in winter, its movements would naturally take on deep symbolic importance. This solar awareness might explain why so many ancient monuments, even in regions far from the Arctic, are carefully aligned to solstices and equinoxes. Take, for example, the megalithic complexes of Europe. Stonehenge in Britain is the most famous, aligned precisely to the midsummer sunrise and mid-winter sunset, but similar alignments are found in less celebrated sites. Callanish in Scotland, the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney, and numerous passage tombs in Ireland, where the first light of the solstice sun penetrates deep into stone chambers. While these structures were built thousands of years after the warm phases of the Arctic ecosystem, the knowledge and ritual emphasis on solar cycles could be a cultural inheritance, a fragment of polar astronomy adapted to new latitudes. In northern Eurasia, petroglyphs carved into rock faces often depict spirals, wheels, and concentric circles, shapes widely interpreted as solar symbols. Some show reindeer or elk intertwined with these symbols, linking the animal most vital to Arctic subsistence with the celestial body that governs the seasons. The combination suggests a worldview in which survival was explicitly tied to both the land and the sky, a perspective entirely natural for people whose homeland lay under the midnight sun. Moving farther afield, certain motifs appear in unexpected contexts. In Central Asia, Bronze Age petroglyphs show rows of figures with outstretched arms facing a radiant disk. In the Americas, some early mound structures and earthworks are aligned to solstice points, though their builders lived far from the Arctic. These parallels do not prove a direct Hyperborean influence, but they suggest that the symbolic and practical importance of solar alignment was more widespread than local necessity would dictate, as though the idea had traveled with people from regions where such alignments were critical to life. Another potential legacy lies in circular architecture. Classical sources sometimes describe Hyperborea's principal city as circular, with streets radiating outward like spokes and concentric walls enclosing sacred spaces. While no archaeological evidence of such a city has been found in the Arctic, circular layouts appear in various ancient cultures, from the fortified rings of Neolithic Europe to the ceremonial enclosures of Central Asia. Even in the Americas, certain Puebloan and Mississippian sites follow circular or radial plans. While these may have developed independently, the recurrence of such geometry in ritual spaces is striking. A circle, after all, is not only a practical form, it is a solar form, mirroring the disk of the sun and the cyclical nature of the year. Material culture may hold smaller, subtler echoes. Arctic peoples traditionally decorated clothing, tools, and dwellings with repeating patterns, zigzags, chevrons, and diamond shapes that symbolize natural elements like water, mountains, and the sun's path. These patterns, passed down through generations, can migrate with people just as words and genes do. In some Eurasian Bronze Age cultures, similar motifs appear on pottery and textiles far from the environments where they originated. To an untrained eye, these might be dismissed as mere decoration. To an anthropologist, they could be the residue of ancient visual languages. The portability of art also means that sacred objects from a northern homeland could have traveled with migrating groups. Small carvings, amulets, and ritual tools may have been carried south as heirlooms, their meanings adapted to new landscapes. Over time, the original geographic references might fade, leaving only symbolic shapes that continue to inspire reverence. A spiral that once marked the endless summer light could become a sun charm for a farming culture, its polar origin forgotten. It is also worth considering that some ancient structures may have been inspired by memories of Arctic landscapes themselves. A high-latitude environment in summer is dominated by broad horizons, reflective waters, and vast skies. Monumental architecture that emphasizes openness, alignment with the horizon, or reflection of light might unconsciously echo those formative vistas. This could explain the prevalence of horizon-based astronomy in many megalithic cultures. Their builders were replicating not just a functional calendar, but a visual relationship with the sky that their ancestors had valued. The challenge in tracing such influences is that ideas, unlike artifacts, leave no clear layer in the soil. They blend, merge, and reappear in new guises. But when the same themes, solar worship, circular design, geometric patterning, horizon alignment, recur across widely separated cultures, they invite questions. Could these be independent inventions? Certainly. But could some of them be inherited from a shared cultural ancestor rooted in the high north? That too remains a possibility. In the Greek imagination, Hyperborea's architecture was not monumental in the sense of pyramids or ziggurats. It was monumental in harmony, aligned to the stars, open to the sun, shaped by the rhythms of the natural world. If such a place existed, its influence might not survive as ruins, but as a design philosophy embedded in the architecture and art of those who left. Seen in this light, the search for Hyperborea is not only a matter of looking for lost cities under ice. It is also about reading the silent language of shapes and symbols that have crossed centuries and continents, surviving in forms so familiar we no longer notice their strangeness. In these patterns, the North still whispers. Among the many threads that weave Hyperborea into the fabric of world mythology, none is brighter than its connection to the sun. In Greek tradition, the sun was not an abstract force, but a divine presence embodied in the chariot of Helios or in the golden figure of Apollo. And in this mythology, Hyperborea was not simply another distant land. It was the sun's favored sanctuary, a place where light reigned without interruption and the god himself came to dwell. Apollo's link to Hyperborea is one of the oldest in Greek myth. According to the poets, the god would leave his sanctuary at Delhi each winter and journey north, spending the cold months among the Hyperboreans before returning in spring. The symbolism is layered. In the temperate climate of Greece, the sun's power wanes in winter. Apollo's absence mirrors that dimming. In the Arctic, however, the sun behaves differently, disappearing entirely for part of the year, then returning to dominate the sky in summer. For a culture that had heard tales of such extremes, placing the sun god's winter residence in the far north made perfect sense. The Greek historian Herodotus noted that offerings to Apollo were said to come from Hyperborea, carried south in a relay from people to people until they reached Delos. Wrapped in wheat straw, these sacred gifts were said to originate in a land beyond the reach of the north wind. Whether this was a literal trade route or a symbolic representation of cultural exchange, it speaks to a perceived connection between northern peoples and the heart of Greek religious life. The poet Pindar went further, describing Hyperborea as a land where no one by ship or on foot could find the marvelous road to the assembly of the Hyperboreans. In his vision, it was a place of music, feasts, and unending sunlight, a natural home for Apollo, whose domains included music, prophecy, and the healing arts. This emphasis on light and harmony aligns with the way the Greeks idealized balance and perfection. But it also reflects the real-world phenomenon of the midnight sun transposed into a divine setting. Solar myths connected to northern lands are not unique to Greece. In Norse mythology, the sun is personified as the goddess Sol, who rides across the sky in a chariot, pursued by a wolf. While her journey is continuous, the Norse also told of realms where the sun lingered, casting long days and short nights. Such descriptions, while often symbolic, could easily be inspired by first-hand or second-hand knowledge of high-latitude light cycles. In Siberia, certain indigenous groups wove the sun into their shamanic cosmology, describing it as a doorway to higher realms or as a powerful being that traveled between worlds. Among the Yakut, summer solstice festivals are still timed to the sun's peak, celebrating fertility, abundance, and renewal. The imagery of a journeying sun, absent for a time, then returning with life-giving power, resonates strongly with the Greek portrayal of Apollo's seasonal migration. These parallels invite the question, could the Apollo Hyperborea myth encode ancient observations of the polar year? It is entirely possible that Greek sailors, traders, or storytellers encountered accounts from northern peoples describing the sun's unique behavior. In the Arctic summer, the sun's path shifts into a slow, tilted circle above the horizon, creating a continuous glow. In winter, it vanishes, leaving only twilight and darkness. For those accustomed to the regular cycle of day and night, such extremes would seem magical, perhaps even divine. If Hyperborea represented the sun's realm, its inaccessibility would have been part of its power. The Greeks knew that Boreas, the north wind, marked a boundary, not just a climatic one, but a spiritual threshold. Beyond him lay a land where the rules were different, where the sun itself might pause to rest. By placing Apollo there, they located the god's winter retreat in a realm both physically distant and cosmologically significant. Even Apollo's return to Greece each spring has astronomical resonance. In Greek religion, the god's reappearance coincided with the season when the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the land and bringing crops to life. Just as Apollo was associated with healing, the returning sun healed the earth from winter's grip. In this way, the Hyperborea myth served as both a spiritual narrative and a natural calendar. Interestingly, the Apollo-Hyperborea connection also intersects with the idea of a golden age, a time when humans lived in harmony with the gods, free from toil and suffering. In many traditions, such golden ages are linked to specific places, often in the distant past or far from the known world. By situating Apollo's favored people in Hyperborea, the Greeks tapped into this archetype, imagining a land where divine presence was constant, mediated through endless sunlight. Some modern scholars have speculated that the Hyperborean cycle of Apollo could preserve distant memories of actual journeys, perhaps by seafaring peoples traveling to high latitudes during warmer climatic phases. Such voyages would have required remarkable skill but not impossibility. The Phoenicians, for example, were known to sail long distances, and trade routes into the Black Sea and beyond connected the Mediterranean to the Eurasian steppe. Stories of extraordinary lands could easily filter south to be reshaped into divine narratives. Whether or not the myth has a literal core, its persistence speaks to its power. Hyperborea was not just a place on the map, it was a symbol of renewal, light, and perfection. For the Greeks, it embodied the unreachable ideal, a reminder that even the gods needed a refuge, and that this refuge lay somewhere beyond the horizon, in the company of people untouched by the hardships of ordinary life. In the end, the solar myths of Hyperborea are not merely about astronomy or geography. They are about the human longing for a place where light never fades, where the cycles of loss and return are written in the sky, and where the divine is not a distant abstraction, but a presence that walks or sails among mortals. If the Arctic was once warmer and more navigable than it is today, it may not have been a remote cul-de-sac at the top of the world, but a corridor, a maritime highway linking continents. The idea that northern seas could serve as conduits for human movement may seem implausible in our age of icebound polar caps. But in warmer intervals of the past, it wasn't only possible, it was likely. And if such routes existed, they could explain how stories of a land like Hyperborea spread so widely, weaving their way into the myths of cultures separated by oceans. The simplest northern connection is the Bering Strait. During the low sea levels of the Ice Age, Binja was a broad expanse of steppe and tundra. But even when it flooded, the distance between Siberia and Alaska was only about 50 meters, a short passage for skilled mariners in calm summer weather. Archaeological evidence shows that the peoples of both sides shared technologies and cultural traits, suggesting regular interaction. If the waters to the north of Beringia were seasonally ice-free during warmer periods, these same seafarers could have pushed farther along the Arctic coasts, linking with other high-latitude communities. Farther west, the Arctic coastline of Eurasia connects to the North Atlantic through a chain of islands and peninsulas. In the modern era, this route is choked by the permanent ice of the East Siberian and Kara seas, but during climatic warm phases, it may have opened enough for travel in skin boats or small wooden vessels. The indigenous peoples of the north, from the Chukchi to the Sami, have long traditions of coastal navigation using boats built for stability in choppy seas. These vessels, propelled by paddles or sails made from animal hides, could cover significant distances in the long days of the Arctic summer. One intriguing possibility is that such northern routes linked Europe and North America long before the Norse voyages of the 10th century. The Dorset and Thule cultures of Arctic Canada left artifacts that bear resemblance to objects from Siberia, suggesting that contact, direct or indirect, crossed the pole. The Norse sagas themselves record knowledge of lands to the far north and west, some described as rich in game and timber. While most scholars see these as references to Greenland and Labrador, the saga's vague descriptions of summer-long days and ice-free coasts hint at older inherited geographic knowledge. The idea of transpolar contact also appears in the realm of trade goods. Archaeologists have found adrift copper from the Coppermine River in Canada in sites far to the west in Alaska, while obsidian from Siberia has turned up in sites far to the east. While these materials could have moved through slow multi-generational exchange networks, the distances and time frames suggest that at least some of the movement was relatively direct. If the Arctic Ocean could be crossed in segments, stopping at seasonal camps or islands along the way, the exchange of goods and stories becomes plausible. To the south of the Arctic proper, another set of routes connects northern Eurasia to the Atlantic. The river systems, the Obi, Yenisei and Lena rivers in Siberia and the Pora in European Russia, all flow northward into the Arctic Ocean. In warmer periods, these rivers could have been navigable far inland, linking the Arctic coast to the vast interior of Eurasia. goods, people and information could travel from the steppe to the sea and onward along the coast, forming a network that paralleled more familiar southern trade routes. In this way, stories of a northern land, its light, its abundance, could move from community to community, eventually reaching cultures far removed from its source. Seafaring traditions in the high north also reveal an adaptability to extreme conditions that could support long-distance voyages. The umiak of the Inuit, for example, is a large open boat made from driftwood frames and sealskin coverings capable of carrying dozens of people. It is designed for both speed and stability and can be paddled or sailed. While today these boats are used mainly for hunting and local travel, in the past they could have served as exploration craft following coastlines for hundreds of miles. Even the Greenlanders of the Norse period who settled on the island's southern coast ventured north along the west coast to hunt walrus and trade ivory. They reached as far as Ellesmere Island facing the Lincoln Sea, one of the most challenging bodies of water in the Arctic. That they managed such voyages in the colder climate of the late medieval period suggests that earlier warmer eras would have made longer voyages more feasible. The possibility of transpolar or circumarctic contact also raises questions about the spread of symbolic systems. Certain solar motifs, geometric patterns, and animal imagery appear in both Eurasian and North American Arctic art, sometimes with striking similarity. While convergent evolution in art is possible, such parallels invite the question of whether they share a common origin, perhaps from a high-latitude culture whose influence radiated outward in multiple directions. If such contact occurred, it would not have been constant or easy. The Arctic is a volatile environment even in its warm phases. Storms, shifting ice, and unpredictable currents would have made long voyages risky. But human history is filled with examples of people taking extraordinary risks when the rewards, trade goods, new hunting grounds, alliances were worth it. And beyond material rewards, there is the human drive to explore, to see what lies beyond the next headland. In the Greek myth of Hyperborea, the land is remote and unreachable by ordinary means. Yet, in some versions, offerings from Hyperborea reach Dos by a chain of intermediaries. If we strip away the mythic framing, this could be a poetic memory of information and perhaps goods traveling from the far north through multiple hands and lands. The northern route may not have been sailed in a single epic journey, but in many smaller voyages, each connecting one link in a chain that spanned continents. Modern oceanographic studies support the idea that the Arctic Ocean during certain periods of the Holocene had reduced sea ice in summer, especially along coastal margins. Combined with the lower sea levels of earlier times, this would have created more land for staging points and easier navigation. For the people of such a time, the north would not have been a forbidding end of the earth, but a navigable frontier. And if the Hyperboreans of Greek legend were based on real high-latitude peoples, then perhaps they were not as isolated as the myth suggests. Perhaps they were connected by boats, by trade, by shared stories to a ring of cultures circling the top of the world. Seen this way, Hyperborea is less a lost paradise and more a vanished hub, the center of a network that the ice eventually broke apart. If Hyperborea was more than a dream, if it was a real high-latitude homeland for ancient peoples, then its disappearance must have been as profound as its existence. Myths rarely preserve the details of a slow fade. They remember the dramatic, the sudden, the overwhelming. And in Earth's recent history, there is one event that fits this pattern perfectly. The younger Dus, a climatic snapback into near glacial conditions around 12,900 years ago. Before the younger Dryas, the planet was warming rapidly. The vast ice sheets that had gripped North America and Eurasia were retreating, seas were rising, and ecosystems were shifting northward. In the Arctic, this meant longer summers, ice-free coasts, and rich grasslands where mammoths and reindeer grazed. Human populations could expand into these territories, exploiting marine and terrestrial resources in a way that may have felt almost limitless. Then, in a geological instant, the warmth collapsed. Average temperatures in the northern hemisphere plummeted in some regions by as much as 14 tentakins within a human lifetime. Glaciers surged forward again. Sea ice returned to choke northern waters and storms intensified. Whatever stability the north had enjoyed was shattered. For communities living in high latitudes, the change would have been catastrophic. The cause of the Younger Dryas is still debated. One leading hypothesis points to a massive influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic from melting ice sheets, possibly when a glacial Lake Agassiz in North America catastrophically drained. This sudden pulse of fresh water disrupted the Atlantic meridian, overturning circulation, the ocean conveyor belt that carries warm water northward. Without that heat, the Arctic froze over again. Another theory suggests a comet or meteor impact which could have triggered massive fires, atmospheric dust loading, and rapid cooling. Supporters of this impact hypothesis point to a layer of microscopic spherules, melt glass, and elevated platinum levels found at sites across multiple continents, all dated to the onset of the Younger Dust. Regardless of cause, the effects were brutal. Coastal settlements would have been trapped behind expanding sea ice. Inland communities would have seen their hunting grounds vanish as plant life withered. Rivers once filled with fish could freeze solid for months. The megafauna that sustained many high-latitude cultures, mammoths, woolly rhinos, steppe bison, began their final decline. For humans, this was not just an environmental challenge, but an existential one. Faced with these conditions, many groups would have been forced to migrate southward. Those who had known only the abundance of a warm Arctic would now carry with them the memory of its loss. In a few generations, that memory could transform into legend. A land where the sun shone without setting, where food was plentiful and winters mild, destroyed by a cataclysm beyond human control. Some archaeological evidence hints at population disruptions during this period. In parts of Siberia, the number of known sites drops sharply after the onset of the Younger Dust, suggesting abandonment of marginal areas. In North America, the Clovis culture, famous for its distinctive stone points, disappears from the record around the same time, replaced by more regionally varied traditions. While these changes may reflect adaptation rather than collapse, they align with the idea that environmental upheaval forced rapid cultural transformation. The loss of northern lands was not solely a matter of cold. As ice sheets advanced, sea levels paradoxically continued to rise over the long term, fueled by the melting of other glaciers and thermal expansion of the oceans. Low-lying areas of the Arctic shelf that had been prime hunting and settlement zones were gradually drowned. Communities could not simply wait out the cold. The land itself was vanishing beneath them. For those who fled south, the trauma of displacement could have imprinted deeply on their oral histories. The catastrophe would be remembered not just as a loss of territory, but as a cosmic upheaval, a punishment from the gods, a war between forces of heat and cold, light and darkness. Such framing is common in myth worldwide. In the Greek imagination, the north wind Boreas might have been recast as the force that forever blocked the way back to Hyperborea. In other cultures, the sun's absence or dimming might be explained as its retreat from a broken world. If a network of northern communities had once traded, shared knowledge, and maintained cultural ties, the Younger Dust could have shattered it completely. Without the seasonal voyages and exchanges that kept stories alive, each fragment of the network would preserve its own version of the past, altered by local concerns. Over millennia, those versions would diverge, leaving only the faintest family resemblance between a Greek poet's Hyperborea, a Norse seafarer's Ultim, and a Siberian shaman's Summerland of the spirits. In this light, the Younger Dust becomes not just a climatic event, but the historical rupture that explains why no physical Hyperborea has been found. Its cities, if they existed, could be buried under permafrost or drowned on the continental shelf. Its monuments could have been dismantled for survival or abandoned to the ice. Its people could have been absorbed into the populations to the south, leaving only genetic traces and fragments of their worldview behind. Even today, the Arctic holds the scars of that catastrophe. In Greenland's ice cores, the Younger Dry is marked by a sharp change in isotopic ratios, a frozen spike of cold in the slow climb out of the ice age. In lake sediments across the north, layers of dust and charcoal hint at sweeping fires and barren landscapes. The earth remembers even when human records do not. For the modern seeker of Hyperborea, the younger Dus is both a challenge and a clue. It explains why so little physical evidence might remain. Yet, it also provides a timeline, a moment in history when a great northern land could have been lost. Somewhere beneath the ice and sea lies the before and after of that story, waiting for the day when science can bridge the gap between climate data and cultural memory. Until then, Hyperborea endures as a survivor in myth, a bright, unreachable shore glimpsed across the dark gulf of catastrophe. While mainstream archaeology and climatology approach Hyperborea with caution, acknowledging intriguing hints but demanding hard evidence, a parallel conversation has unfolded on the edges of academic consensus. In this realm, writers, researchers, and speculative historians have woven the fragments of myth, geology, and archaeology into sweeping narratives about a lost polar civilization. These interpretations often blend fact with conjecture, blurring the line between disciplined hypothesis and visionary storytelling. Yet they have helped keep Hyperborea alive in the public imagination, giving it a modern voice long after its ancient one fell silent. One of the most prominent figures in this arena is Graham Hancock. In his books and documentaries, Hancock suggests that the world's myths preserve a memory of an advanced Ice Age civilization, a culture that flourished during a period of relative warmth, only to be destroyed by a cataclysm around the end of the last Ice Age. While he does not always identify Hyperborea by name, the concept of a northern homeland recurs in his work. He points to similarities in ancient megalithic architecture, advanced astronomical alignments, and myths of civilizing gods who came from distant lands, often associated with the north or the sea. For Hancock, Hyperborea could be one thread in a much larger tapestry connecting prehistory across continents. Zechariah Sitchin, though more controversial still, took the idea in a different direction. Interpreting ancient Mesopotamian texts, he proposed that humanity's early civilizations were influenced by extraterrestrial visitors, the Anunnaki, who may have had a presence in polar regions. For Sitchin, the extreme north and south could have been ideal bases for such beings, remote yet strategically positioned for planetary observation. While mainstream scholars reject his translations and conclusions, his work fed into the modern mystique of the poles as sites of ancient power and hidden knowledge. Robert Schoch, best known for his work on geological weathering at the Sphinx, has also entertained the idea that advanced cultures existed much earlier than accepted by orthodox archaeology. He links sudden climatic shifts like the Younger Dus with the abrupt disappearance of these cultures. In interviews and essays, Schul has speculated that a high-latitude homeland, perhaps even within the Arctic Circle, could explain certain commonalities in myth and ancient science. These thinkers are often criticized for extrapolating far beyond the evidence. Academic reviewers accuse them of cherry-picking data, ignoring contradictory findings, and blurring myth with literal history. Yet their work taps into a deep public hunger for narratives that connect the dots between desperate ancient mysteries. And in the case of Hyperborea, they keep the question alive. What if the legend is not pure invention? Some fringe theorists focus specifically on polar geography. Hollow Earth proponents, a small but persistent group, have claimed that Hyperborea was not merely at the pole but within it, accessible through hidden openings at the Arctic. They interpret ancient descriptions of lands beyond the wind as coded references to inner worlds lit by a central sun. While this idea lies firmly outside scientific plausibility, it demonstrates the adaptability of the Hyperborean myth. It can be reinterpreted to fit almost any cosmology. Other modern reinterpretations lean more heavily on geology and paleoclimatology. Writers like Charles Hapgood argued that sudden shifts in Earth's crustal displacement could move entire continents into and out of polar regions within human memory. In Hapgood's model, a once temperate Arctic could have become icebound in a geological blink, erasing the evidence of civilizations that had flourished there. While modern plate tectonics does not support Hapgood's exact mechanism, his idea inspired figures from Albert Einstein, who wrote a foreword to Hapgood's work, to later authors seeking natural explanations for lost worlds. The appeal of these fringe perspectives lies partly in their narrative freedom. Mainstream scholarship, constrained by peer review and rigorous methodology, advances cautiously. Fringe history can leap, connecting myths from Greece, Siberia, and the Americas in a single breath, uniting petroglyphs, megaliths, and astronomical data into one grand theory. This freedom makes for compelling storytelling, even if the chain of evidence is tenuous. And yet, even speculative approaches sometimes stumble onto real insights. Decades before paleoecologists confirmed the warmth of certain Arctic periods, fringe writers were already proposing a green habitable pole. Before the discovery of ancient settlements like Jana, RHS, and Zhukov Island, the idea of permanent human habitation in the high Arctic was dismissed outright by most academics. In both cases, the evidence did not prove the grand claims of a lost supercivilization, but it did show that reality could be stranger than orthodox timelines assumed. Fringe histories also serve another function. They act as cultural repositories, preserving myths and obscure accounts that might otherwise be forgotten. While their interpretations may be flawed, their collections of cross-cultural parallels, ancient maps, and neglected folklore create a body of material that can be revisited with more disciplined tools. In this sense, even the most speculative Hyperborean theories contribute indirectly to the broader conversation. In the popular mind, the Hyperborea fringe history is often a shining city beneath the aurora, a realm of advanced knowledge, harmony with nature, and perhaps even technologies we can barely imagine. This romanticized vision owes as much to modern ideals as to ancient sources, but it is no less potent for being an invention. Indeed, it mirrors the way ancient Greeks projected their own ideals onto Hyperborea, turning it into a reflection of what they valued most. Mainstream researchers may never embrace these expansive reconstructions, but they cannot ignore the public fascination they inspire. In the end, the Hyperborea of fringe history is a reminder that myth is not static. It evolves, shaped by each era's hopes, fears, and understanding of the world. Whether as a poetic metaphor, a lost homeland, or an alien outpost, the idea of a civilization at the top of the world remains too evocative to vanish entirely. Perhaps somewhere between the rigor of science and the leaps of speculation lies the real story, one that neither camp has fully uncovered. Until then, Hyperborea lives on, not just in the dusty pages of ancient poets, but in the restless imagination of those who cannot stop asking, what if? By the dawn of the Renaissance, the classical world's geography had been partly rediscovered through ancient texts. Yet, the far north remained as enigmatic as ever. Hyperborea, though absent from maps, endured in poetry, allegory, and art, reshaped by each generation's imagination. For Renaissance humanists, it was less a literal place than a canvas on which to project ideals of purity, wisdom, and the untouched. And as Europe entered the age of exploration, the image of Hyperborea became entangled with the expanding boundaries of the known world. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the revival of Greek and Roman learning brought figures like Herodotus, Pindar, and Strabo back into circulation. Translators and commentators, fascinated by their references to a land beyond Boreas, began to speculate on its possible location. Some aligned it with Iceland, others with the mysterious Ultima Thule described by Pytheas. Gerardismerk's famed 16th century world map even placed an elaborate depiction of the Arctic featuring 4 great rivers converging on a magnetic mountain at the pole, an image that blended ancient hearsay with medieval cosmography. This vision of the North as a center of natural forces resonated with the Renaissance fascination for harmonies between the human, the earthly, and the celestial. Literature of the era often invoked Hyperborea as a metaphor for untouched virtue. In pastoral poetry, it was the unreachable Arcadia transposed to a polar latitude, a realm unspoiled by the corruption of cities. Torquato Tasso, the Italian poet best known for Jerusalem, alluded to far northern lands of perpetual light in his lyrical works, using them as symbols of divine favor and eternal truth. In France, Renard and his fellow poets revived classical imagery of Hyperborea to frame their visions of poetic immortality, associating the eternal day of the far north with the undying nature of art. The visual arts also found inspiration in the myth. Renaissance and Baroque paintings occasionally featured allegorical maps or celestial spheres in which the north was given symbolic rather than geographic treatment, a space populated with godlike figures, winged boreas, and sunlit temples beneath auroral skies. These depictions often owed more to Neoplatonic philosophy than to any literal belief in Hyperborea, portraying it as a realm where earthly beauty mirrored the perfection of the heavens. By the Enlightenment, the myth began to intersect with emerging science. Natural philosophers driven by curiosity and the expansion of global navigation speculated about the polar regions not merely as wastelands of ice, but as potential havens of unusual climate. The theory of a hollow earth advanced in various forms by Edmund Halley and later popularized in imaginative fiction sometimes placed a Hyperborean-like civilization within or beyond the pole. While the scientific community largely dismissed such ideas, they found a willing audience among the reading public, especially in an age hungry for wonders that might rival the discoveries of the New World. The Romantic era, with its embrace of the sublime and the exotic, gave Hyperborea new life. Poets and painters turned towards the poles as landscapes of grandeur and mystery where human limits met nature's extreme. Percy Bysshe Shelley in his fragmentary notes and verse referred obliquely to lands of eternal light, hinting at the same fascination with the sun's peculiar dance that had captivated the Greeks. Lord Byron too wove imagery of distant cold realms into his work, using them as metaphors for emotional isolation and unspoiled beauty. Painters of the 18th and 19th centuries, influenced by both Romanticism and the accelerating pace of Arctic exploration, began to depict northern scenes that blended reality with myth. C.A.'s Per Dalton Wied. Friedrich, the German master of Romantic landscape, painted the Sea of Ice, ostensibly a depiction of a polar shipwreck, but infused with a symbolic weight that invites readings of the Arctic as both a literal and metaphysical frontier. His jagged ice, bathed in eerie light, could easily frame the imagined ruins of a Hyperborean temple just beyond the viewer's sight. Explorers themselves sometimes became conduits for the legend. Accounts of voyages to Greenland, Baffin Bay, and the Russian Arctic filtered back to Europe, laden with descriptions of strange light phenomena, vast herds of animals, and traces of human habitation in unlikely places. While these observations were factual, they fed into the public's appetite for a polar world that might still harbor wonders beyond science's reach. Fiction writers seized on these reports, reworking them into narratives where remnants of an ancient polar people, wise, noble, and elusive, survived in hidden valleys or on ice-free islands. By the mid-9th century, the Victorian fascination with lost civilizations found a natural ally in Hyperborea. Popular periodicals published serialized adventures set in the far north, where explorers discovered cities of crystal, libraries of forgotten wisdom, and inhabitants descended from the Hyperboreans of Greek myth. These stories often mirrored imperial fantasies of the time, the notion that distant, untouched places awaited discovery by the modern West. Yet they also carried a strain of melancholy, acknowledging that such paradises might vanish the moment they were found. In the fine arts, the pre-Raphaelite movement occasionally brushed against Hyperborean themes, particularly in their idealized depictions of mythic landscapes. Painters like Edward Burne-Jones, while more focused on Arthurian and classical subjects, sometimes used northern light and icy backdrops to evoke a sense of otherworldliness consistent with the legend. Throughout these centuries, Hyperborea served as a cultural mirror. In the Renaissance, it reflected the ideal of harmony between man and cosmos. In the Enlightenment, it became a thought experiment in natural philosophy. In the Romantic period, it was a stage for the sublime. And in the Victorian imagination, it was a setting for tales of exploration and loss. In none of these periods did Hyperborea function as a fixed geographic hypothesis. It was always pliable, reshaped to fit the needs of the storyteller or the painter's canvas. And yet, despite these shifts, certain constants remained. The light that never fades, the distance that defies easy travel, and the sense of a people living in alignment with forces greater than themselves. These elements, inherited from antiquity, ensured that Hyperborea retained its mythic charge long after the original cultures that spoke of it had vanished. By the end of the 19th century, as Arctic exploration reached its modern limits and the map's white spaces were filled in, Hyperborea seemed destined to retreat fully into the realm of metaphor. But the 20th century would prove otherwise. For even as the last physical mysteries of the Arctic were charted, new cultural and political forces would breathe life into the legend again, sending it in directions the ancients could never have imagined. By the 19th century, the age of sail had shrunk the map of the world to a handful of blank spaces, and the Arctic loomed largest among them. For centuries, Hyperborea had existed in literature and art as a poetic ideal, but now ships were leaving European ports to penetrate the icy barrier itself. The explorers who braved the far north were not searching for Apollo's summer home. They were looking for new trade routes, scientific knowledge, and national glory. Yet again and again, their accounts returned with details that echoed elements of the old myth, strange lights, unseasonable warmth, and signs of human presence in places the maps marked as void. The earliest wave of modern Arctic exploration was driven by the dream of the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the Arctic connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In 1818, the British Admiral began sending expeditions deep into the ice. William Edward Perry's voyage of 1823 reached further into the Canadian Arctic than any before, and his journals recorded encounters with Inuit communities who spoke of lands to the north that were warmer and richer in game. To Perry, these were simply local hunting grounds, but to a mind steeped in classical lore, such reports could have been interpreted as whispers of a Hyperborean remnant. Other explorers encountered more tangible mysteries. In 1879, the ill-fated Jeannette expedition, commanded by George W. Dong, became trapped in the pack ice north of Siberia. The ship drifted for nearly 2 years before being crushed. But during the drift, crew members observed strange phenomena: large stretches of open water far north of the expected ice line and seabirds flying from the direction of the pole. These sightings fueled speculation that an open polar sea might exist, a warm water ocean encircled by ice, perhaps even sheltering unknown lands. The idea was not new. 18th century seagraphers like Merkur had sketched similar concepts, perhaps influenced by ancient legends. The Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen's 1893-1896 from expedition was designed to test the theory of polar drift, but it also brought back uncanny impressions. Nansen and his companion Hjalmar Johansen, attempting a dash to the pole, found themselves navigating in conditions that alternated between brutal cold and inexplicable thaws. They reported mirages, towering cliffs, and distant land masses shimmering above the horizon. Some of these were likely phantomena, optical illusions caused by atmospheric refraction, but to the popular press of the time, they revived the possibility that unknown islands, perhaps even the last refuge of a Hyperborean culture, awaited discovery. The pursuit of the pole in the early 20th century by figures like Robert Peary and Roald Amundsen eventually proved that no great warm sea or hidden continent lay at the top of the world. Yet even these expeditions occasionally stumbled upon anomalies. Peary, for instance, reported sighting a large landmass northwest of Ellesmere Island in 1906, which he named Crocoland. When a later expedition went to find it in 1913, they found nothing, only an extended mirage. Still, the notion that there were places the ice concealed and revealed at will fit neatly with the long-standing image of the North as a realm of shifting boundaries. Not all mysteries were visual. Some were cultural. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, explorers recorded Inuit oral traditions that spoke of other peoples, tall strangers, sometimes pale-skinned, who had come from across the sea and vanished again. While most of these tales likely refer to Norse contact during the Greenland settlements, others are harder to place, suggesting encounters deep in the past. Whether these memories were of actual visitors or mythic archetypes, They contributed to the sense that the Arctic was not a static void, but a crossroads in its own right. Um, Scientific observations from these expeditions um, also lent quiet support to the idea that the North had not always been frozen. Fossilized wood was found on Ellesmere Island. Preserved plant matter surfaced from thawing permafrost. Ancient beaches and shell beds were discovered far above current sea level. These findings pointed to a warmer Arctic in the geological past, exactly the sort of environment in which a culture, like the one imagined in Hyperborean legends, could have thrived. The expeditions also brought back the aurora borealis as a vivid cultural image. While the aurora had been seen in more temperate latitudes, sustained observation in the high Arctic revealed its full awe-inspiring scope. Curtains of green and crimson light rippling across the night sky could easily be imagined as the visible breath of Boreas or the radiance of Apollo's northern home. Artists and writers seized on the aurora as a symbol of mystery, often pairing it with references to the Hyperboreans or other mythical northern peoples. By the interwar period, polar exploration had shifted from a heroic quest to a scientific program. Airships and airplanes extended the reach of explorers photographing the ice from above. While these flights mapped islands and charted glaciers, they also deepened the sense of the Arctic as a dynamic place, one that could change dramatically from year to year. Ice floes broke apart to reveal hidden waters. Storms reshaped coastlines. New islands rose temporarily from volcanic activity. Each of these phenomena in another age might have fed the legend of a land that appears and disappears beyond the wind. Even today, the logbooks and diaries of these expeditions read like a fusion of science and myth. They speak of seas that freeze overnight, of light that bends in strange ways, of life thriving in unexpected pockets. And while they never found a city of the Hyperboreans, they confirmed something just as important. The North is not inert. It is a place of movement, transformation, and hidden complexity, fertile ground for the kind of stories that gave us Hyperborea in the first place. In the end, the great polar expeditions did not disprove the legend so much as shift it. They filled in the map's white spaces but left intact the deeper mystery. Why so many cultures imagined a land of abundance and light in a region the modern eye sees as barren? The answer may lie not in what they failed to find, but in what they revealed. That even in the age of science, the Arctic resists full possession, holding on to its secrets in the shifting interplay of ice, sea, and sky. By the early 20th century, Hyperborea was no longer just a distant land in the popular imagination. It had evolved into something more abstract, a symbol of origin, a cradle of wisdom that seeded the great civilizations of the ancient world. This transformation was not the work of explorers or seagraphers, but of philosophers, mystics, and esoteric thinkers who saw in the legend of Hyperborea a key to humanity's forgotten past. For them, the icy realm beyond the north wind was not merely a physical location, but the point of departure for migrations of people, ideas, and spiritual truths. In occult circles, Hyperborea began to be linked with the idea of a primordial tradition, a body of knowledge said to predate recorded history, encompassing astronomy, geometry, agriculture, and metaphysical insight. Writers such as René Genin and Julius Evola, though differing in their interpretations, both place the origin of this tradition in a polar homeland. To them, the North was not simply geographic, it was symbolic of stability. The axis mundi, the cosmic axis around which the heavens revolve. Hyperborea in this reading was the earthly reflection of that axis, a place aligned with the stars in both space and meaning. The Theosophical Society, founded by Helena Blavatsky in the late 19th century, further developed this vision. Blavatsky described successive root races of humanity, each originating in different sacred lands. For her, the second of these races had lived in Hyperborea, which she placed in a region corresponding to what is now the Arctic. She claimed that the Hyperboreans possessed extraordinary longevity and spiritual powers, existing in harmony with the forces of nature before the world's axis shifted and their homeland was plunged into cold. While these ideas were speculative and deeply metaphysical, they found an eager audience among those dissatisfied with conventional history. Some proponents connected Hyperborea's supposed knowledge to tangible ancient achievements. They argued that megalithic structures such as Stonehenge, the Goth Circle in Germany, and the vast stone alignments at Carac in France displayed a level of astronomical precision that must have been inherited from a more advanced culture. Since many of these alignments involved tracking the solstices and the movements of circumpolar stars, the idea emerged that their designers might have been preserving a memory of life in high latitudes where the sun behaves in extreme ways. In this framework, Hyperborea was not merely a mythic Eden, but a university of the deep past, a place where humanity first learned to read the sky, calculate the seasons, and perhaps even conceive of the earth as a sphere. Advocates pointed to similarities in mythologies worldwide, gods or culture bringers arriving from the north, bringing with them agriculture, laws, and the arts. In Greek tradition, Apollo's seasonal journey from Hyperborea to Delhi could be seen as the symbolic transfer of wisdom from the polar homeland to the Mediterranean. In the Vedic hymns of ancient India, there are references to dawn lasting many days and to a people living where the sun stood still. Descriptions that some interpret as echoes of polar experience. The connection between Hyperborea and sacred geometry became another focal point for these theories. Certain esoteric schools claim that the proportions of ancient temples, the layout of ceremonial sites, and even the dimensions of the Great Pyramid reflected knowledge of the Earth's polar circumference and axial tilt. If such knowledge existed in antiquity, where could it have come from? For Hyperborean theorists, the answer was clear. It originated in a civilization that had observed the heavens from the vantage point of the far north, where celestial motions appear in their purest form. Of course, these ideas remain outside the mainstream. Archaeologists attribute the skills of ancient builders to local innovation, cultural exchange, and long observation without requiring a vanished Arctic progenitor. But for those who believe in a Hyperborean origin, the lack of direct evidence is not an obstacle. Rather, it is part of the mystery. They argue that the destruction of Hyperborea, whether by climate catastrophe, axial shift, or flooding, would have erased most physical traces, leaving only the knowledge carried by survivors as they migrated south. In the 20th century, these concepts filtered into popular culture through a variety of channels: speculative non-fiction, fantasy literature, and even political ideology. While some appropriations were benign, others twisted the myth to serve dangerous purposes, seeking to link Hyperborea to ideas of racial purity or territorial destiny. This misuse complicates any modern discussion of the legend, showing how a symbol of universal origin can be recast into a tool of exclusion. Yet, in its more open and imaginative forms, the idea of Hyperborea as a center of knowledge continues to inspire. Modern alternative historians often pair it with emerging scientific evidence about rapid climate change at the end of the Ice Age. They point to submerged structures off the coasts of Japan and India, the discovery of sophisticated artifacts in unexpected contexts, and the resilience of certain astronomical traditions as hints that fragments of a lost coherent system of knowledge have survived in pockets across the globe. In recent decades, digital mapping, satellite imagery, and undersea surveys have revealed more of the Arctic's past than ever before. Paleoecologists have reconstructed ancient forests that once grew within the Arctic Circle, while geneticists have traced human lineages back through corridors of migration that might once have connected a green polar region with the rest of Eurasia. None of this proves that a Hyperborean academy of the ancients existed, but it does make the idea of long-term human presence in the far north less implausible than it once seemed. Ultimately, the vision of Hyperborea as an ancient center of knowledge serves two intertwined purposes. On one hand, it invites speculation about humanity's deep past, challenging the boundaries of conventional timelines. On the other, it acts as a metaphor for the origin point of all understanding, the north that exists in the mind, a place from which clarity radiates outward like sunlight on a summer solstice. Whether real or imagined, It asks us to consider that civilization may have roots far older and far stranger than we yet comprehend. And so the legend persists, part history, part dream, part mirror, held up to our own longing to know where we began. In that longing, Hyperborea remains alive, a white flame burning in the shadowed archives of memory. There is a place on the map where lines of longitude converge so tightly they seem to disappear into a single point, a mathematical illusion that hides in plain sight. It is there at the very top of the world that the myth of Hyperborea has always lived, just beyond the last black contour of the gnome. The Arctic wind is different here. It doesn't howl. It murmurs as if carrying the residue of languages no longer spoken, syllables smoothed into pure sound by centuries of snow. Those who have come close speak of a stillness unlike any other, not the absence of motion, but a suspension, as though time has paused to listen. Above the sky shifts with the weightless choreography of the aurora, green waves folding into violet, violet dissolving into gold. Each color spills into the next without border, like memory bleeding into dream. In the long summer, the sun skims the horizon without falling, tracing a slow circle that turns the ice into a mirror. In that mirror, it is said the past sometimes looks back, far below the surface, in the dark strata of permafrost, are roots of trees that have not touched air in tens of thousands of years. Their fibers are dry, their shape intact, ghosts of a forest that once drank from rivers, now locked in ice. Fossilized pollen drifts in the silt of ancient lake beds, grains so small they can ride the wind for miles, carrying with them the scent of a climate long vanished. Somewhere in that wind might be the echo of footsteps, or so the story would have it, pressed into soil when this latitude was warm. There is no city here now. No columns, no walls, no library of carved stone waiting to be found. If Hyperborea existed, the ice has taken everything but its outline, leaving only fragments scattered across time. A name in a poem, a diagram in an old map, a legend told by firelight in a village at the edge of the world. Yet the absence itself becomes a kind of presence, a space where the imagination insists on building. The more the ice resists, the more vividly the mind supplies its own architecture. Temples bathed in the low amber sun, courtyards open to a sky that never darkens, gardens walled not by stone but by the curve of the horizon. Some nights in the high Arctic, when the temperature drops far enough, sound travels for miles. A voice shouted on the edge of a fjord can bounce off unseen ice cliffs and return, altered from a direction the speaker did not face. It is easy in that moment to believe you have heard an answer from somewhere else. Perhaps this is how the myth has lasted, not through proof, but through resonance. Each generation hearing its own question reflected back from the north. The explorers have gone. The ships have rotted. The last dog sled trails have been erased by drifting snow. But the pole remains cold, shifting, light struck, as if guarding something not meant to be reached. There is a moment standing there when the compass loses its meaning, when every direction becomes south and the idea of home turns inside out. It is then that you realize the myth was never about a fixed place. It was about the movement toward it, the act of following a line that can never be completed. Imagine walking alone across the ice in late summer. The air is clear enough to make every shadow sharp. Far off, a single bird wheels in the light, its wings catching the sun, so it appears and vanishes in alternating flashes. The ice beneath your feet is ridged and scored, marked by forces you cannot see. Somewhere below, the deep ocean moves in silence. Somewhere above, the sky carries colors it doesn't have elsewhere. And somewhere you cannot tell if it is ahead or behind is the edge of the world. The place the old stories call Hyperborea. You do not arrive, you do not even see it. But in the space between each step, there is a change. Not in the land, but in the way you listen.